distinguished guests, on behalf of Hudson Center for Latin American Studies, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's conference on the Argentinian crisis. We are living in an age of unprecedented optimism about Latin America's economic future. Countries such as Panama and Peru have experienced China-level growth. Tens of millions of Brazilians have escaped from poverty. A majority of Mexicans now belong to the middle class. Colombia is being hailed as a potential Latin American tiger. And Chile has been the fastest growing economy in the OECD. Unfortunately, one country that has been moving in the opposite direction is Argentina, which has Latin America's fourth largest population and either its third or fourth largest economy, depending on which exchange rate you use. Since 2007, the government of Senora Cristina Kirchner has nationalized private pensions, seized Argentina's largest airline. It has grabbed a majority stake in a foreign-owned oil company and also electricity distributorship. It has used central bank reserves to repay public debt. It has imposed draconian currency controls and the largest number of protectionist measures worldwide, according to Latin Business Chronicle. And also, it has severely reduced press freedom. The result has been runaway inflation and food shortages and energy shortages and massive capital flight and warnings from the rating agencies and condemnations from global press organizations and the strong possibility of yet another Argentine debt default. If not for Cuba and Venezuela, Argentina would be the lowest ranked Latin American or Caribbean country in the Heritage Foundation 2013 Index of Economic Freedom. Argentina ranks 160th overall out of 177 countries or territories. By comparison, in 2003, the year Mrs. Kirchner's late husband, Nestor, was elected president, Argentina ranked 68th out of 156 countries or territories. Not surprisingly, President Kirchner's approval rating is deep underwater, and her government is facing enormous public demonstrations. On November 8th, anywhere from 250,000 to 1 million people descended on the capital city famous Plaza de Mayo as part of a gigantic anti-government protest. On November 20th, labor leaders organized a general strike. One of the issues we will be discussing today is how Argentina's recent behavior will affect its diplomatic standing in forums such as the G20. We all have our own thoughts on the question, but for now, let me point out that after President Kirchner announced the nationalization of Spanish-owned Oil Argentina company YPF, both the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal called for Argentina to be expelled from G20. Stranger things happen these days. We're fortunate to have today a stellar group of panelists. They are very well known and their biographies attest their achievements. The speakers will present their remarks in the order they are seated, starting with Embajador Lino Gutierrez. Once all the presentations are completed, we will open a period of questions. We will thank those asking questions to share with us names and affiliation. And without any further ado, I turn the podium to Ambassador Gutierrez.
Good afternoon. As I was walking from the metro to the Rayburn building this morning for a breakfast in 13-degree weather, which for somebody born in the Caribbean is not a good thing. But I was thinking, what a great time to be in Argentina today. It would have been. I don't feel like that every day, but today I certainly did. So I spent 3 years in Argentina, of course, 2003 to 2006, the beginning of the Nestor Kirchner government. And as I look at Argentina today, I see a very different picture than I did throughout my tenure there. I see, a reelected president, Cristina Kirchner, reelected by what they called in Spanish una aplastante mayoría. Aplastante is like a, sort of like a bulldozer clearing a path. Aplastando. And today we see a government that appears to be a bit embattled. I see a lot of fronts that are open for this government. With the IMF, of course, it's been a long-standing struggle, battle between both Nestor and Cristina and the IMF. But now we have the World Bank, the WTO, the United States, which is very concerned about their import policies, restrictions of imports. With the World Bank, they're ignoring ICSID rulings, not paying any of the arbitration rulings. The WTO, of course. And not only with, in the economic circles, but in also with the media, pretty much open war with the media, especially a large media, with the judicial sector. Now we see government officials talking about democratizing the Argentine judicial sector. The military's funds have been pretty much eaten up. There's very little the Argentine military can do these days. So we see a constant battle on many fronts by the government. Now, what has really carried Argentina the last few years has been their economic growth, which was 9% for 4 or 5 years in a row. I think this year, though, it's down to 2.1%. And the economic policies were the economic success can be explained by what some observers call the S&S policy, economic policies of the government, which is in Spanish is suerte y soja, which means luck and soybeans. The Chinese, of course, buying. I'm sure you will tell us about that, Dr. Ellis. But how long can this last is a question. There is talk of removing Argentina from the G20. There is talk about making Argentina face consequences for what world financial circles deem to be, inappropriate conduct by a state. But Argentina doesn't seem worried. President Kirchner is currently on a trip to Abu Dhabi, Indonesia, and Vietnam. First, he stopped in Cuba, ostensibly to wish Mr. Chavez well. According to the president, Mr. Chavez is about to make a remarkable recovery and may go back to Venezuela. We'll see what happens there. But also to talk to Raúl and Fidel Castro. And then she went to Vietnam, where she compared Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese who had fought the Americans as the equivalents of their founding fathers of Argentina, Belgrano, Mariano Moreno, and others, and highlighting all the damage done by U.S. bombing to North Vietnam. It doesn't seem to me that they're in any hurry of writing relations with the U.S. We've gone through a number of episodes the last few years, unnecessary episodes, where during one of which the foreign minister went to the airport to order the opening of some boxes that came in a U.S. military flight for an exercise to be conducted with the Argentine police. Everything fully cleared with the Argentine Foreign Ministry, as had been done many times before, but a media circus was created, in my opinion, for no reason at all. For what purpose? I think the Obama administration really was interested in pushing a reset button with Argentina. I do not speak for the Obama administration, so I will not, do not take my words for an official statement, but I don't think that they have seen it's in their interest to do anything more. At one point, my successor in Argentina was prevented from visiting government ministries. This is all over the famous Valija Gate, where funds were found at the airport, ostensibly that came from Venezuela for Cristina's first election campaign. But they equated the actions of a federal prosecutor with the actions of the U.S. government. And I think Argentina is sophisticated enough, the Argentine government, to know that the U.S. executive does not control the other branches of government. So, you know, there have been two incidents that really have set back our relations, the protectionist policies. The Argentine economic policies have gone from an occasional intervention by the state in the key sectors to just a nakedly statist approach. So where is this leading? As Ambassador Daremblum noted, Mrs. Kirchner's approval rating has gone down. What is the next step? Re-election, third terms. She would not be the first Argentine president to look for a third term. Menem tried it, and others. It would require a constituent assembly, but there's a level of discontent now being felt in Argentina that had not been there before. And what's sad about the whole thing is it did not have to be this way. In the first 2 years of Nestor's administration, we had some pretty good cooperation going between the United States and Argentina. We had cooperation on counterterrorism and international fora. At the beginning of the Nestor Kirchner administration, he exhibited fiscal responsibility, the first Peronist to balance a budget in history, and things appeared to be going well. We had a good modus operandi. And then in Mar del Plata, 2005, President Nestor Kirchner decided to throw his lot in with the Chavez's and Evo Morales of the hemisphere, and the culmination being in December when Argentina paid off the IMF. And who did President Nestor Kirchner thank? But he thanked President Chavez for his support when it was the U.S. who had held back the hordes that wanted to make Argentina pay. In this case, other countries of the G8, where the U.S. was a voice for moderation in dealing with Argentina. So, does the Cristina Kirchner model work? And will it work in ensuring her stay in power and having a successful presidency? It's hard for me to see how it will. But again, I've been surprised before. And what's sad is it didn't have to be this way. Today you could have an Argentina that is much more developed, with real economic statistics, with cordial relationships with the international community, and with good prospects for growth. which is something you don't see today. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Hill?
I'm going to speak from over here more than anything so I can see my own slides. First of all, I want to thank the Hudson Institute and Ambassador Daremblum for inviting me here. It's a real honor for me to be able to share my thoughts with all of you as part of this very, very distinguished group, and of course the many of you very distinguished persons in the audience. Second, I want to give a special thanks, as those of you who have had support from your own research staffs know. I want to recognize with us today in the audience three people who have been very, very useful for me at the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies in supporting my research. Florian de Kloot, Karen Smolnik, and Eric Skidmore. Eric, Florian, Karen, I wonder if you could just stand up very briefly. They also braved the cold and have been extraordinarily helpful. So if I remotely look credible with detail and analysis, it's largely in part to their efforts. And thirdly, a disclaimer, because my center, the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, is a U.S. government institution, I need to be emphatic that nothing that I say today, and my opinions are relatively strong, reflect the opinions of either the center or the U.S. government. Having said that, I'm going to go relatively quickly over what I've presented, but of course I will leave my slides behind for your reference. First of all, obviously, Argentina, as the ambassador pointed out so eloquently, is a bit of a paradox. You have, since about 2003, gross national product growth that has averaged 9% a year, with the exception of the most recent year, which may come in, depending on whose estimates you believe, at near zero or perhaps about 3%. Next year's growth also projected about 3%. Consistent trade surpluses, thanks largely to soy exports, although not entirely. Averaging the previous year about $10 billion, last year $12 billion, and believed to be $12 billion for the present year. And yet a palpable sense in Argentina itself that things are really falling apart. You have a sense, especially with the Paco drug epidemic right now in places like Buenos Aires, that there is increasing crime, frustration with perceived corruption in administration, a sense that the transportation infrastructure is falling apart with a number of relatively serious major accidents and other problems. Labor unrest, we had major strikes. We had, of course, in December, a series of looting events across the country. Two major national protests, one in September, one in November, that brought, by some estimates, 700,000 people out on the streets, along the same level of seriousness of those which a decade previously brought down the Argentine government. And so what is happening in the seeming paradox between the good and the bad? The best way that I think I can characterize the situation in economic terms is that Argentina is a highly sophisticated economy, albeit one based largely in agricultural production, but also manufacturing and technology and a remarkable diversity. But it's a highly sophisticated economy which is by its nature inherently connected to the international system. But, especially in the past decade, although not the first time, being run fundamentally as a closed statist economy. It's an economy that you can't disconnect from the world. You can't cut off from the international financial system. But in some ways, the current government, as has been alluded to, is trying to do so. And many of the consequences that we've seen reflect that contradiction. I believe the question of whether we are heading towards a just eking along or a more significant crisis, especially with the upcoming congressional elections this year, really reflect 6 things that I want to talk about. One, of course, is the issue of soy production. Second is natural gas, which my esteemed colleague from Repsol will also have, I believe, something to say. The debt question, the IMF question, the question of capital flight, and of course the question of politics. And again, I'm going to be relatively brief. I won't have time to go into detail, but to certainly be happy to do so. What I believe is makes soy so important. Obviously the numbers are striking. Soy accounted for between 1/4 and 1/2 of all of Argentina's export revenues during the previous year. There are some concerns, of course, because despite the fact that soy is at relatively record levels, keep in mind that when Argentina experienced its 2001-2002 crisis, soy was at about $150. It's now just over 500. And so Argentina has certainly had a lot of suerte in having soy prices so high. We saw some problems in the 2011-2012 growing season. Of course, some of the soy production was lost because of drought. In the most recent planting season, we see some difficulties because of the extensive rains, which affects the entire agricultural sector. But why is agriculture in soy so important? Fundamentally, the problem is that because Argentina, through its debt management policies and through other policies of largely Cristina's administration, has cut itself off from the flexibility that one has in the international financial system, which means that Argentina has to run its country as if it were someone who had just defaulted on the debt payments for their car. It needs to generate foreign currency earnings through its export revenues, such as soy and a few other options, and use that fundamentally to pay its bills. So if the revenue generators get too low, or if the expenses get too high, Argentina has a fundamental economic crisis that it cannot escape from as easily as countries more conventionally connected with the international financial system. The issue of gas, and again, based on the presence of my colleague here, I'm only going to touch on this very briefly, but Argentina, largely to fuel thermoelectric plants and others, although it's a gas producer, has become a net importer of natural gas to fuel many of these plants and other things. As a result, Argentina last year had to pay, I believe, between 11 and $14 billion of its hard-earned foreign currency earnings to pay for that gas. That consumption is going up while Argentina's own gas production is going down for a number of reasons that have to do with, among other things, the nationalization of the Repsol assets, which have to do also with some other poor decisions, some labor unrest. And although gas production only declines slightly overall, it's interesting that when you look for the private producers that accounted for about 2/3 of gas production last year, their production, according to some estimates, was down about 13%. And so the declining gas production and the prospect that things will only get worse, for reasons I suspect you'll hear shortly, creates another thing that narrows Argentina's maneuvering room. Obviously, much has been said about the debt crisis, the world's attention grabbed by the November district court ruling of Judge Grisa, and the punting that down the road, at least for a while, with the district court. The real issue of that is the fact that Argentine debt, which because of the 2005 and 2010 debt negotiations, they are able to negotiate down from its original level of about $95 billion to about $30 billion. Argentina, it became critical for Argentina to scrupulously pay off that renegotiated debt. And the prospect was that the 8% of that debt that remained in the hands of the holdouts, the so-called vulture funds, the Grisa ruling seemed to indicate that that debt would have to be paid before or at the same time as its restructured debt, which would at least have technically forced Argentina to default on that debt with a couple serious consequences. Now, it's likely that the appeals court will both enforce the concept of full payment to the holdouts while simultaneously giving more flexibility so that Argentina is not forced to default to do so. And we'll know that at the end of February. But the implications, there are a number of important implications, and one of those, of course, is the principle that the IMF, as it looks to European debt restructuring, if this is a legal principle that is upheld, it casts a pall on those other types of debt restructuring deals. But for Argentina, as the ambassador alluded to, it creates a situation where Argentina becomes even more of a pariah with even less negotiating room in the international financial community than it already has. With respect to the IMF sanctions, obviously Argentina's government reports inflation to be under 10%. Analysts believe that it is between 25 and 30%. This has been no end of frustration for Christine Lagarde and the IMF. The IMF has continued to punt this issue down the road and will probably continue to do so. The issue is it's very complicated to say that a G20 nation should essentially be kicked out of the IMF. Also, from pragmatic terms, this February 1st, when Ms. Lagarde is going to brief the executive board of the IMF, keep in mind that of its 8 members, 2 are Russia and China. Russia in the form of Gazprom and others, and China in the form of Brightus, and behind Brightus, CNODC, both have interest in the petroleum assets that were seized by YPF from Repsol. So there are multiple layers of these consequences. But the IMF sanctions legally also, if that shows that there was bad faith in estimating inflation, that could have severe implications for many of the other legal cases before the CIADI, as well as before the on the debt issue. And it also raised significant issues about the relevance of the IMF in Latin America. So it's a very difficult position for the IMF. Capital flight, about $87 billion of capital has fled the country since 2003. It was a lot higher, almost 8% of GDP at one point in anticipation of the currency controls which were put in place in 2012. It's gone down a little bit, but there's really 2 major consequences that are farther limiting maneuvering room. One is that it's really alienated the middle class. It's not only eaten into people who want to go on vacations in the United States or otherwise and who need dollars, but it's also destroyed the real estate market, much of which was previously denominated in dollars. It's contributed to an informal dollar market. It said that the official dollar could go as high as 6 this year, 6 pesos per dollar, and the so-called blue dollar, the black market dollar, could go as high as 9.4, according to some estimates. And so this is an issue that farther eats into Argentina's desperate need to manage the foreign currency that it has. But at the same time, its efforts to plug the flows farther limit its maneuvering room. Politics, I won't go into, because of time, details. I'm happy to go to in greater details, but in short, as the ambassador also alluded to, there's a real sense of frustration with the administration. We saw that, of course, the re-election of President Fernandez de Kirchner was with a vote of about 54% of the country in the year after the President Nestor Kirchner's death. It was with an initial approval rating of about 64%. Now polls are showing that approval at about 22%. You have 700,000 people coming out in the streets in November. You have looting. You have the 2 major unions, the CGT and the CTA, beginning to mobilize against the government. You have, as was alluded to, a sense that both the media and the judiciary have serious problems with the government. So again, at a time in which the economic options are running out, you have some very, very significant political resistance as well. And just very briefly on the question of China, it's interesting because, and I'll go into this in the question and answer so that I don't deprive too much time of the other speakers, but Argentina has depended and come to depend significantly on China, not only in the petroleum sector and as a purchaser of its soy, but also in terms of providing liquidity through the $10 billion loan swap of 2009, through the proposed $10 billion infrastructure investments. And Argentina has successfully done a number of things that has basically shot its prime remaining beneficiary in the foot. The nationalization of the Belgrano-Cargas line just after Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao had agreed to provide additional funding for that, difficulties with respect to Brightus, difficulties with blocking China's own investments in things like the urea plant in Tierra del Fuego, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It remains to be seen whether China will continue to be patient with Argentina, especially as Argentina moves itself away from other options and depends ever more on China. So with that, I will. I thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to go into further detail in any of this in question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Douglas Farr.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for the invitation to be here. To excuse me, to Jaime for hosting this event with so many distinguished colleagues here. I thought I'd focus on something a little different, which is I think there are 2 interrelated factors, or maybe 3. One is as Ambassador Gutierrez talked about earlier. You have this movement toward a more authoritarian state in the trying to shut down go after the independent media and several other steps, and I think that that directly ties to the model that's already been in place across the region, which is the Bolivarian Revolution. And as you see Cristina's behavior change, it becomes increasingly following the model that Chavez has successfully pioneered in Venezuela, and which President Correa and President Morales in Bolivia have also taken further down the road. So a model exists. I would say she's not operating in a vacuum in how she moves forward with her political crisis and her economic crisis. And the second I want to touch a little bit on is the huge growth in Argentina's role in transnational organized crime, particularly the methamphetamine production. If you look at their pharmaceutical imports, they've quintupled in the last from 2010 to 2011, with no noticeable increase in their actual pharmaceutical production. And there have been several major busts in Sinaloa related to Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, directly tracing the ephedrine for methamphetamine production into the Sinaloa cartel. So I think you have, and if you look at the donors of in Cristina's campaign, and this is documented from her own campaign documents, about a third of her funding in 2007 for her election campaign came from large pharmaceutical companies that are largely run by cronies of Cristina's government, who are closely tied to the shipping companies and others that were moving the ephedrine and other products north. So I think you have, as you've seen again in the Bolivarian states, a criminalization of the state itself, as opposed to what we normally look at in Mexico and other countries, where narcos tend to want to corrupt a particular person, a particular judge, a particular aduana agent, a particular policeman to look the other way. You don't have, you have sort of a more bottom-up corruption there. In Argentina, as you're seeing in Venezuela and in Bolivia particularly, you're having a top-down corruption. You have a state decision to employ parts of transnational organized crime as instruments of the state, and I think that's extremely worrisome, because as the state comes under significant more pressures economically and other things, in the past, at least if you look at the Bolivarian states, and I would guess that Cristina will do something very similar, you see them moving more and more, becoming more and more dependent on the criminal enterprises for survival, because that's what will generate the revenue that they need in ways that they can't generate through economic models that tend to be rather failures over time. And the thing I want to focus on most is, I think, one of the things that people in this administration and Congress have found one of the most alarming aspects, and that is Argentina's sudden swerve toward becoming much closer to Iran, which is, I think, given the history of Iran in Argentina, going back to the 93 bombing of the Israeli embassy, and particularly the 1994 bombing of the AMIA building there, and the deaths that ensued from there, I find quite alarming, particularly given that move toward Iran is closely tied to Fernandez's move toward the Bolivarian states and the alliance with the Chavez government, which is already quite heavily aligned with Iran. And I think one of the things that is causing a lot of internal tensions within Argentina itself is the fact it's not too different from the United States deciding to negotiate with al-Qaeda over the bombing of 9/11 and trying to negotiate the cases away. As you'll recall, Interpol has issued red notices for the current Minister of Defense of Iran, Mr. Vahidi, Mohsen Rabbani, who was the key architect of the AMIA bombings, and several other senior Iranian officials. And that had been a fairly well-established Argentine policy. They would routinely not meet with Iran under any circumstances. And when Iran went to the United Nations General Assembly every year, when Iran got up to speak, the Iranian delegation would leave, in part because they invested an enormous amount in, if you read the document itself of Alberto Nisman and Mr. Burgos, who wrote the indictment of the AMIA case. It's 800 and some odd pages. It's a fascinating document because the investigation into the AMIA bombing started out, as you probably know, in quite rocky circumstances. The initial prosecutor was eventually tied to other corruption related to the case, and the case seemed to be going downhill. And then Alberto Nisman and Mr. Burgos were named prosecutors, and they sort of took the investigation to a much different level. And through the years, and because of the work they were able to do with multiple other countries, including the United States, able to trace in enormous detail the role of Hezbollah, the role of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the role of the Iranian embassy, MOIS, the Iranian intelligence service, in the planning, procurement of the explosives, the renting of the vehicle that was used in the car bomb, in great, almost minute by minute detail up to the Amia bombing, and they asked for Nisman asked for the red notices to be issued by Interpol, which after great review and tremendous Iranian efforts to get them to be not issued, they were in fact issued. And if you look at the crux of it, to negotiate this away, and for the first time in 2012 at the National Assembly, the Argentines didn't leave in the UN National Assembly, and then the foreign minister began negotiating directly with the Iranian officials about the fate of those on the Interpol red notice. And Iran says quite clearly, the Argentine, Mr. Timmerman, the foreign minister of Argentina, has said repeatedly, well, they're just sort of talking. They're looking for a solution. They're trying to get there. Iran doesn't do that. They said, you asked, when the Iranian officials asked what they wanted from the negotiations, they said, we expect these indictments to be buried, to go away, and to stop bothering our relations on the international field and with Argentina. So there's much more clarity on the Iranian side of what they're looking than what Argentina is willing to say, and I think that's intentional because the trauma inflicted by the 1994 bombings is significant and deep, and the rapprochement with Argentina, with Iran, is, I think, internally quite controversial. And if you look at one of the reasons why, I think one of what Dr. Ellis was pointing out is partly the trade and the surplus. Argentina's trade with Iran is running about $2 billion this year in exports, and their imports from Iran are less than $10 million because Iran doesn't have a great deal to offer. Most of it's soy and meat. And so you see this huge trade surplus developing it's risen dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years, increasing dramatically. So Argentina is benefiting enormously from Iran's ability to buy their products, but I also think that as Argentina has moved into the Bolivarian camp, where you have the specific desire to ally socialism of the 21st century, of the Bolivarian Revolution, with a theocratic regime of Iran based almost solely and exclusively on their intense dislike for the United States, I think that there's political gain for Iran in this too. Iran is working very hard because it gives them a whole new way, a whole new country, a serious country that's not some of the smaller ones that have offered their support, but a real country in Latin America that's willing to do business with them, and a country that's willing to help them defy international sanctions. And if you look at how Iran has operated across the region, they have used specific countries as they diversify out of Venezuela into Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, particularly, and now into Argentina. They're working with specific countries to do specific things. And you can see in Ecuador the building of a financial system that allows them to evade international sanctions through the central bank and other small banks. It's quite clear. And what they appear to be doing in Argentina is Chavez has requested personally of Cristina, when they met in 2009, to please help him be able to broaden out Iran's contacts in the region, because Venezuela was under a lot of scrutiny. They seem to be also working significantly with Iran in broadening the base for breaking economic sanctions. So I think that as we look at the region, there are all of the internal problems without question. And I think on a larger scale, the movement into the Bolivarian revolutionary camp and the ability or the willingness to realign, and despite huge internal political costs, with Iran should also give us pause. And I'll leave it there.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to appreciate the invitation of Hudson Institute for participating in this panel with such distinguished colleagues. And thank you all for your presence as well. Well, I would like to make some remarks on the fact that Argentina has become a country in which the rule of law can be not counted on anymore. And I will try to make these remarks, of course, informed by our experience, by Repsol's experience with the confiscation of YPF. But I would like to make clear that the YPF case goes well beyond a particular circumstance of the relations between Repsol and Argentina, and it gives signals of much broader concern. We think that the situation in Argentina today poses challenges to, of course, international investors. Nobody can be sure anymore that their investments are protected by the law in Argentina, and our case is a clear example of that. And different initiatives by the Argentine government show that returns from these investments are also at risk increasingly. Second, to the international community, I will also try to make a point that if something like the expropriation of YPF goes without consequences, then the rule of law will be at risk, globally speaking, and I will try to elaborate on that. And third, this situation poses challenges to the Argentine society. Probably the ones that are going to be mostly affected by this new way of behaving is going to be the Argentine society. We've been parts of the Argentine society for many years, and we see this with a special concern. There is no doubt that the investment climate in Argentina has deteriorated very clearly in the last decade, and especially since President Cristina Fernandez's re-election for a second term. All initiatives by the government have in common that they reduce the economic freedom, that they increase economic interventionism and legal uncertainty, and there is a common disrespect for private property rights and for the rule of law. I think this is what all these initiatives have in common. Many of them have already been mentioned. It's been explained the situation of the debt default and how the restructuring took place, although still there are a number of stakeholders that continue to request being paid by the Argentinian government. Also, still there is a large claims outstanding under the Paris Club umbrella. They amount to something like $6.7 billion. There have been other initiatives like laws limiting the purchase of lands in Argentina to foreigners. We have already heard about the lack of credibility of statistics about inflation and other economic parameters. We've heard about the currency controls. In Argentina, the purchase of dollars for savings and property are just banned outright. This is something that doesn't happen in many countries. And also we've heard a little bit about how Argentina is closing the imports through not very clear, not written sometimes regulations. For instance, you know that Argentina, the Argentine government requires importers to balance imports with exports through unwritten but systematic procedures. In the energy sector, there are also many examples. You know that when in April 16th of last year, when the government of Argentina started the confiscation of YPF, they gave the reason that this was how they were going to avoid the energy chaos that was beginning to take place in the country. As we will see, the reality has been just the opposite. The situation has worsened since the confiscation. Because the problem in Argentina is that during the last years, the government has tried to pay producers less than what costed to produce the energy raw materials, and making consumers pay for the energy less than what energy costs. That has been how they have tried to run the energy sector in the country, and of course this hasn't worked. The oil production has decreased in the country and gas production as well. They haven't given any reason for efficiency to the energy matrix in the country. When you keep prices artificially low, then what you are encouraging is consumption. And in Argentina, they have encouraged the consumption of oil and gas without any efficiency. And today, Argentina is one of the countries in the world in which oil and gas have the majority of the energy mix. Today, Argentina has more than 90% dependence on oil and gas in their primary energy mix. They have a policy of keeping prices artificially low that have brought electricity companies to serious financial troubles. Some of the energy companies, some of the utilities are almost in bankruptcy. But the demand has continued to grow. We have seen already some figures. Imports of LNG, of natural gas from Bolivia, of fuel oil or gas oil have continued to grow. And today, this is almost amounting to the same amount of money that they are getting from selling the soya to the international markets. And so in the last years, instead of increasing production in the country, instead of reducing imports, instead of using energy raw materials in a more efficient way, they have done exactly the opposite. And this is accelerating after the confiscation of YPF took place. Of course, they are trying to give more incentives to producers because they see that the reasons they gave for the confiscation are proving wrong. And they are trying to give more incentives to try to stop the decline in production. And they have increased the price of gasoline by 25% since the expropriation. And they have increased gas price at wellheads by 44%. I mean, they have done things that if would have been suggested by Repsol before the confiscation would have been considered absolutely crazy. They are being done now with no material result. This is the reality. There have been other examples of interventionism in the energy sector in Argentina. I would like to mention Decree 1277 of July the 27th. Through this decree, the Argentinian government requires private oil and gas companies operating in Argentina to provide their plans of investment, and these have to be authorized by the government. I mean, private companies operating in a more or less liberalized sector have to be approved by the government for their plans of investment. This is progressively looking like something like not so an open economy anymore. The YPF case is a very clear one. You know that on April 16th, the Argentinian government started a process to expropriate without compensation. That's why we call it a confiscation, not an expropriation at all. 51% of the shares of YPF. 51% of the shares only from one shareholder, Repsol. None other shareholders were affected. No Argentinian shareholders were affected. Only one shareholder was confiscated. Therefore, we understand that this was an illegal, arbitrary, discriminatory initiative by the government. And that's why we are using all our means to try to get back the value of YPF for our shareholders. Of course that we understand that any government has the right to expropriate an asset as long as it does it according to the legal framework, international commitments, and as long as they pay a fair compensation for the expropriated assets. This hasn't happened in Argentina, and that's what we are demanding. We want to be paid a fair compensation by a company for which we paid in the 90s $15 billion in cash. This initiative by the Argentinian government doesn't only affect Repsol, it affects hundreds of thousands of investors in many countries, in the US as well. We think that something like 14% of YPF shares were owned by US investors, so the damage has been done also to them. As I said, the YPF confiscation is a flagrant violation of the Argentine constitution, the YPF bylaws. The YPF bylaws established that if the government wanted to take back the control of the company, they had to launch a 100% bid for the company. They never did that. So they have been breaching not only bilateral investment treaties or not only international commitments, they are violating also the own Argentinian legal framework and the YPF bylaws. Of course that this is a clear violation of the bilateral investment treaty between Argentina and Spain, and this is what has opened the door for requesting international arbitration by Repsol. We have already initiated the process for international arbitration at ICSID. It has been, however, already being presented that Argentina has many other previous cases in ICSID. As a matter of fact, Argentina is the country in the world with more cases in ICSID. They have been sued by investors of many countries: Belgium, Luxembourg, Chile, USA, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, the UK, in more than 50 arbitration cases. They have almost always lost. There have been 18 cases in which it was alleged the violation of bilateral investment treaties. Argentina lost 17 of these 18 cases. But there is one very interesting figure. They have never paid anything at all. I mean, Argentina is a member of ICSID Convention. Argentina is brought to ICSID continuously. They almost always lose and they never pay. This is how the situation stands. I mean, the matter is the international community going to do something about that, or is it okay? I mean, do we have rules of the game to comply with them or not? Because if not, we think it's absurd to try to keep on behaving as if nothing is happening. Well, I don't want to use more time because we are going to have probably your questions. I would like just to finish with a couple of comments. First, the US is a very relevant actor about all this. Some of the ICSID cases involve US investors. Some are very well known. For instance, Azurix. You know that Azurix was awarded the water treatment service in the center and south of the province of Buenos Aires in 1999. It was a 30-year concession. It was canceled by the Argentine government 3 years later. Of course, Azurix sued Argentina in ICSID. They won. They received an award requiring Argentina the payment of $165 million. Argentina never paid. This one of the cases that led to the suspension of Argentina's designation as a beneficiary country of the GSP, the Generalized System of Preference in Trade. And in the presidential proclamation that suspended Argentina in the GSP, it said Argentina has not acted in good faith. And I think this is a way of sum up all we have been talking about. The Argentinian government, I make myself to say Argentinian government, not Argentina, because the Argentine society is something very different from that, but is not acting in good faith. The consequences have been already mentioned. here, WTO, IMF, OECD. You know that the OECD Investment Committee is also studying if the confiscation is a breach to the Declaration on International Investment and Multinational Enterprises, to which Argentina subscribed in 1997. We have seen also the position that the Argentine government has brought the country in several indexes like Heritage Foundation. So I conclude. Today, Argentina is ceasing to be an open economy. The consequences are being paid by international investors, but most significantly and most regretfully by the Argentina society. If a country wants to be a respected member of the international community, a respected member of G20, has to comply with the rules of the game. It has to be like that. Every country, the US, the European Union, and others, have to try to make Argentina understand that being a member of the international community implies some obligations as well. And if not, then the rule of law will be seriously undermined. Yesterday, it was presented in Brussels by a very reputed European think tank, a document, a policy brief that asks, pariah in the world economy, how should countries respond to Argentina's return to economic nationalism? And it ends saying, Argentina's misbehavior in the world economy has reached such proportions that inaction can no longer be the policy response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Porzekaiski.
Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you very much to Ambassador Daremblum for the invitation. And I want to start by making a clarification because a lot of facts were cited, but one definitely needs a clarification. And this has to do with the Argentina litigation, which I have followed very closely because my field of expertise is international finance at the intersection of international financial law. So I have been following all the litigation very closely for many years. Dr. Ellis mentioned that Argentina is being forced to default by the courts. And I just wanted to clarify that surely he meant something else. The federal courts are not forcing Argentina to default. They are requiring that Argentina pay all of their bondholders, that they stop discriminating among bondholders, choosing to pay some and not others. The speculation is that because Argentina, from the president on down, has said that they would like to keep discriminating among bondholders, that maybe they would end up paying nobody rather than everybody. But there is no compulsion, certainly from the federal courts, as you can imagine. They would be crazy to do that, to force a sovereign or any creditor to default. What they want is for Argentina to pay, and to pay everything that they owe, because as we have heard, even in the case of Repsol and others, there is a problem of their thumbing their nose at all kinds of court judgments and arbitral awards. Having made that clarification, let me make my remarks that hopefully will summarize what has been said here so well. Being the last speaker, there's a little new that I can say, so my objective is to just say it better. And hopefully close and pave the way for your questions. To paraphrase Baroness Margaret Thatcher, the problem with populism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. And populism in Argentina nowadays is running out of money. thus conforming to a cycle that has always been observed with populism everywhere it has been tried, especially in Argentina. Eventually, it always runs out of the genuine tax resources, out of credit, out of the savings from not paying the bills, and out of usable international reserves, and then it loses credibility with local investors, it loses the confidence of bank depositors, it loses control of the streets, all of which are necessary for the government to keep doing what it has been doing, which is increasing government spending faster than revenues, maintaining key prices like energy and public utilities artificially low via controls or subsidies, keeping interest rates below the true rate of inflation, undermining property rights, including through the expropriation of private pensions and other assets without compensation, leaning on the central bank to hand over more and more of its hard currency reserves, preventing cheaper imports from coming into the country and forcing companies to export what they don't produce, stopping people from buying dollars and saving or spending them as they wish, appeasing the labor unions by decreeing wage increases while letting companies increase most prices as much as the market will bear, bullying political opponents, intimidating the press, annoying your regional neighbors, and picking fights with the United States. And last but not least, covering up the nature and scope of the problems that populism has created. Add to the inherent fatal flaws of populism as a development model an increasingly autocratic leader with narcissistic personality disorder and great ideological inflexibility, who has surrounded herself with an increasingly small circle of yes men and women, and you have all the ingredients for a movie with a very bad ending. Indeed, the way things are going, I am certain that President Cristina Kirchner will not make it to the end of her term in office. Considering the following highlights of 2012, she made a lot of political enemies while losing many allies. After several years of rapid economic growth, and despite record high commodity prices, the economy stagnated because the business climate has been ruined. The central bank increased the money supply at an annual rate of 40% versus a pace of 20 to 30% prior to 2012, sowing the seeds for faster inflation this year. Companies have lost their competitiveness and profitability. They are no longer able to afford wage increases that keep up with the true rate of inflation. So the labor unions are getting restless and will be going on strike more and more often from now on. A real estate bubble that kept many people feeling rich has now been pricked, so people are understandably unhappy about that. There have been a series of massive street protests as well as episodes of supermarket looting, fatal mass transit accidents due to poor maintenance, all in the context of rising street crime. So the level of public insecurity and discontent have really increased. It shows in a collapse of President Kirchner's popularity in just the past year. Access to and use of external finance by the public and private sectors has diminished to next to nothing. The gap between the official and unofficial exchange rates has never been wider. Argentine bond prices are severely depressed, and the noose around Argentina is tightening in terms of court judgments against it and negative attitudes at the IMF and the State Department. So the question is whether Captain Cristina, as her loyalists called her when she went to Mar del Plata to greet the returning Fragata Libertad, is at all capable of tacking the tall ship of state in a constructive direction. This is the $60 billion question. As things stand, she is sailing the vessel directly into the wind, but no tall ship can do that and get to where it wants to go. The ship has to be turned away at an angle, and then it has to zigzag, sailing as close to the wind in one direction and then changing tack to have the wind blowing on the other side of the sails. It is by tacking continually that a tall ship can sail in the direction from which the wind is blowing. I'm sure that if her late husband Nestor were in command of the ship of state, he would be tacking continually. But Captain Cristina is a very different person. I think that her political ambition has blinded her, and I fear that she may end up like the real-life captain of the HMS Bounty replica. As you may have heard, for some unfathomable reason, that captain decided last October to leave safe port and set sail straight into Hurricane Sandy, one of the biggest storm systems ever to hit the east coast of the United States. And he ended up sinking the Bounty off of Cape Hatteras and drowning with it. For Argentina's sake, I hope that I'm wrong and that Captain Cristina will soon learn how to sail the ship of state. And that means how to change tack. Thank you.
Muy bien, muy bien. Muchas gracias. After all this stimulating and interesting presentations that we have had today, we're opening space for questions, comments with the public. But first, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I'm here, which is by several of our speakers here, it was mentioned the transactions between Argentina and Iran. Do these transactions in any respect violate the U.S. rules on the embargo placed on Iran?
I think there are two sets of transactions. One are the ones that are reported legally, and those are the sales of soy and meat and stuff, and those don't. What I think is more worrisome is the number of transactions that seem to be acting as bridge transactions between Venezuela and Venezuela and Iran that are now passing through Argentina. And if there's a series of documents which whose authenticity I haven't been able to verify. It's consistent with how Iran has behaved in other circumstances, and that is routing sanctions-busting transactions through Argentina to disguise them as coming from Venezuela or through or Argentina or Iran. So there are multiple mechanisms they use in particularly in Ecuador and Venezuela that are very identifiable. They seem to be doing the same thing there, and if those are in fact happening, then it's on a very large scale and would be in direct violation not only of U.S. sanctions but of the UN sanctions.
Anyone has? Okay, we're open for questions. Microphone.
I have a short question. My name is Tom Mansbach. I'm from law firm Rustin and Becky. Nobody has mentioned the increasing problem once again with the Falkland Islands. Would anyone care to put a sentence or two together on that one?
As you know, oftentimes nationalism is a wonderful way to deflect attention from economic and other political problems at home, and I think we've certainly seen that pattern here. Everything that I've heard seems to indicate that at least the diplomatic action seems to have calmed down a little bit during the current year. As you're aware, there is Cristina forced her allies and other members of UNASUR into some difficult decisions last year. My understanding is that Chileans, although expressing sympathy for the position, ultimately chose to allow from Punta Arenas continuing oil resupplies, which would have really put a damper on the ability to do drilling in the vicinity of the Falkland Islands, which would have had real economic impacts. My understanding is that Uruguay, to some degree, also has continued to allow the continuation of logical resupply to the Falkland Islands, although, as you know, there's been some movement with respect to cruise ships. I think there was a case recently where they decided not to put into port in Argentina because of concerns over this issue. Of course, major chess move on the British and the Falklands is the referendum to decide on this issue themselves, and of course the issue of self-governance is also a strong one. But politically, I see this as primarily as a distraction and one with particular reverence in Argentina. But I think the international implications were largely handled and probably well last year without things really blowing up.
Let me say something.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, never underestimate the strength of the nationalist fervor in Argentina. I think when Repsol was expropriated, a poll showed 60% of the people were in favor of the expropriation, and we'll call them the Malvinas to give them equal time because we call them the Falklands, is always a rallying point to Argentines, most notably in 1982 when the Galtieri junta decided to try to deflect criticism for the poor handling of the economy by invading the Malvina Islands, thinking that Britain did not have the stomach for war and that they would get away with it. But what I found kind of interesting was that in this latest trip where President Kirchner is in Abu Dhabi and these other places, she did not take the official Argentine plane Tango 1 in 757, but she leased a British plane to go on her trip. So it's not a total
And more than that, it's the same company that flies the London to Falklands route.
okay. Go figure.
Okay, please. Would
Yes,
you
my
give
name-
us name and
Yes,
affiliation?
my name's Cornelia Weiss. I was lucky enough to be a student of Dr. Porsakansky. And I wanted to follow up on one of your comments. You said that Argentina right now is annoying regional neighbors. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, we didn't speak a lot about that here, but many of the measures that have been put in place in the past year or two have had spillover effects onto neighbors. So, for instance, when they impose a number of administrative restrictions on imports, that has affected imports from Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. So the Brazilians and the other two have gotten quite annoyed. In the case of Brazil, they have retaliated with some of their own red tape in terms of importing something from Argentina. That's one example. The other example is the exchange controls that have made it more difficult to buy dollars at the official exchange rate. That's driving people to the parallel market where a dollar costs at least 50% more than in the official market. That has had a spillover effect on Uruguay and Brazil in terms of tourism spending. It's now summer down there, and there are not as many Argentines, and they're not spending as much as they would otherwise. I think also the whole move in terms of Mercosur, using what I consider an excuse to bring in Venezuela and throw out Paraguay was another thing that has annoyed a number of the other neighbors, especially on the other side of the Andes, and those would be examples. Clearly also the energy, the whole energy picture has ramifications because Bolivia could be exporting more gas to Argentina, but there are problems there. And so the whole energy market regionally, domestically, has been distorted by decisions made in Buenos Aires.
I would like just to make a comment on that. And there are other ways in which the Argentine situation is influencing their neighbors. You know, for instance, that the EU has been negotiating a free trade agreement with Mercosur for a long time. And the confiscation of YPF has clearly made things more difficult. The EU has made clear that these kind of behaviors make more complicated reaching agreements, regional agreements between both blocs. And so the Argentine reluctancy to comply with the rules of the game also make things more difficult for Mercosur as a whole in the negotiations with the European Union.
Thank you. We're going to move now to the left.
Hi, the panel before referred to the current economy as being held up basically by, as a house of cards being held up by a pillar of soy and luck. I wanted to address the question of the internal problems with the soy and the health problems it's creating and the suppression by the government of dissidents who are raising concerns about cancer and birth deformities and breast defiguration. And I just wonder what impact that will have internally, because there is huge reliance on soy, but also given the rejection, the increasing rejection of GMO products, soy and other products around the world. How is this ultimately, isn't this going to expedite this collapse that many of you seem to think is pending pretty soon?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and of course, largely the phenomenal growth of soy exports and the dedication to soy, which is increasingly almost becoming a monocrop for Argentina, is, in my judgment, a reflection of two things: the policies of really both of the Kirchner administrations, as well as the demand of China. As you know, approximately 80 to 85% of all soy oilseed sold actually is directly or indirectly to the PRC, and so that demand is a strong pull. At the same time, as you also recognize, you get into the issue of the retenciones and things like that. And so one of the reasons why it was so much more lucrative for farmers to go to soy rather than some of the traditional, beef and things like that. Indeed, the farmers in Argentina may not even be able to fulfill the Hilton quotient this year of prime cuts of beef. But part of the reason that they went there was the very policies of retenciones made it much more lucrative to export soy than export some. So in many ways, Argentina has done that to itself. Now, you rightfully point out that there are environmental consequences of fertilizer, of dust. You see very similar problems in Paraguay. You see similar issues raised in Brazil where this becomes the case. I'm not an environmental expert, but I think there are certainly valid issues, and there are issues basically of monetizing a monocrop as your primary cash generator, which keeps the government alive. You can make the same arguments about oil in Venezuela and Ecuador. These are the hazards. There are environmental hazards as well as the political and economic hazards of going to a single product economy to generate foreign currency earnings. And this is certainly valid.
Just to explain a little bit how the rules of the game work, all the markets in Argentina are distorted by government policy, and this is an example. So for instance, if you raise cattle and you're a beef producer and you'd like to export your beef, as you've always been able to do, you can't. There has been a ceiling imposed by the government on beef exports for a number of years, which what it does is forces domestic producers to sell the beef at home at a much lower price than they would get if they were able to export it. that's just how the government wants it, of course, because God forbid Argentines should run out of beef. So that is the kind of incentive system that has encouraged people to move from one crop or the other, depending on the export taxes or on export limitations as there are on beef.
Well, I just wanted to take the opportunity to make a quick clarification. We are actually in violent agreement concerning the interpretation of the Greaser ruling. Obviously, the legal opinion did not create the legal obligation to default. That is, of course, a financial decision that created a temptation for the Kirchner administration. Also, in your many references and elegant references to tall ships, I was actually expecting you to mention the Santísimo Trinidad, which is currently slowly sinking to the bottom of
Yeah, it has
Belgrano
sunk.
Harbor.
Right.
If we want to,
It's another, yeah, I was saving that one for my next speech.
okay.
Very good. Yes. Yes?
My name is Silvia Pisani. I am from La Nación newspaper in Argentina. Argentina is now thinking about trying to increase the exportations to the States, to America. Given the fact that usually the Department of State says that the trade is the new tool of diplomacy, which is your expectation, particularly you, Mr. Gutierrez, based in your experience, to Argentina to increase their exportations to America. And the second, as you well know, Argentina is changing ambassadors now here. After 1 year serving here in Washington, Mr. Arguello has been suddenly changed, and now we are expecting another ambassador very close to the strong wing of the Cristinismo. Do you see any message in that change, or do you expect any change in the diplomacy between the States and Buenos Aires with this change, or nothing at all? Thank you.
I think you, Ms. Pisani, and Ana Baron sitting here probably know more about the messages and internal workings of the government than anybody else in the room. But no, as I look at the future and I see no GSP preferences for Argentina, Argentina about to be perhaps sanctioned by the IMF, a WTO case, I don't see much, and the U.S. upset about Argentina's restriction of U.S. imports that caused even President Obama to mention it to President Kirchner at one of these G20 meetings. I just don't see a lot of prospects for increased trade in the next few months. I mean, maybe individually in some products for the mutual benefit of both, but I don't see in the big picture. Maybe somebody else sees it, but I just don't see it. And I don't know enough about the change of ambassadors. I know that Jorge Arguello, whom I knew as a deputy in Argentina, was always a very good interlocutor and a very capable individual, but I don't know anything about his recall.
Now we move to the right.
My name is Alan Manroy, and I'm with the Consensus of the Americas. My question is for Doug, but I would like to hear from others that commented on this as well. You mentioned something about the use of the Kirchner administration in sort of doing things to quell the independent media. Can you comment a little bit more on that and some of the mechanisms they've been using to do that, specifically the judiciary process, and also get any other comments on what they've been doing with the judiciary from other panelists?
Well, I think the main law on breaking up Clarin's holdings, which is the main holding there, was kicked down the road a little bit. So, and they didn't get the quick review of the appeals process that the Cristina government asked for. So I'm not sure. I think that unlike perhaps in Venezuela and in Ecuador and elsewhere, there's enough of a reserve of the judicial process left where there's not complete control, that it's more difficult than she's anticipated to take the really bold steps against the media that she clearly wants to, but she's been somewhat thwarted as the process has gone on by a not quite compliant judiciary as she has probably expected or clearly wanted to happen, and it's something that she clearly takes very personally and was quite upset when she didn't get the appellate court ruling that would expedite it to do what she wanted. She's very upset that they got the stay of the order to break up the Clarín group, which would deprive them of, which would force them to sell many of their media outlets, and obviously cripple them as an economic force. I don't know if I want to talk about the other judicial elements that you might know a lot more about than.
No, I was just going to talk about the non-judicial elements. Namely, there is a policy of intimidation against journalists. The government is using its own state-owned channels, TV channels, and propaganda and advertising to get whatever message it wants out to the public, and to attack, in particular, Clarín and La Nación. They also, as you might know, she very often, more often than any of her predecessors in history, goes on national television and rants and raves. Not quite every Sunday like Comandante Chavez, but used to do, but all the time trying to get her message. And there's just been a level of intimidation and aggression towards journalists. They play favorites, who can accompany the president, who cannot, who can ask questions, who cannot. You may have heard that people in Argentina were quite surprised that when President Kirchner was here in the United States and spoke at Georgetown and Harvard, she actually took questions from the students, because she never takes questions from journalists in Argentina. But then she never meets with a cabinet either. So there have been many ways, but intimidation, I would say, is including using lawsuits and so on. Look at what they've done. I'll speak for my gremio. I'll speak for my fellow economists. Look at what they've done to economists who've dared to say that the officially published inflation numbers are not accurate. They have fined them. They have started lawsuits against them, taking them to court, and a complete policy of persecution. You have to be very careful if you have any opinions or facts that go contrary to the official story.
I think just to add that, the demonization of the independent media is a constant across the sort of the Bolivarian spectrum, and the willingness to call them whatever you want with no accountability, and to sick mobs on them as the Pichicateros and others have done it in Argentina, and certainly in other Bolivarian states, is one of the really, I think, defining elements of how to quell dissent, because you intimidate, but there's this sort of unrestrained ability to just say whatever you want about journalists and what cowards they are, and insult them personally and their sexual lives, their sexual preferences, the food, anything you want is perfectly legitimate, or viewed perfectly legitimate. I think it's a really dangerous and one of the more disturbing signs of how these governments seek to really shorten the spaces in which the independent media can operate.
Decide, Jaime.
Next one. And
You're here in the front.
Miguel Diaz, I'm a Foreign Service spouse. Gentlemen, thank you for your presentation. I have two questions, if I may. One, Argentina is tied to Brazil through history and through Mercosur, and I'm wondering to what extent Brazil has had any moderating influence or could potentially have any moderating influence on Buenos Aires. And the other question for Arturo. Arturo, you and I, we covered Argentina and the rest of Latin America in the 80s and 90s in Wall Street, and could appreciate how fickle investors could be. I mean, Argentina itself went from being the poster child of Latin America to being the current pariah. assuming Buenos Aires will want to win back the good graces of the investment community, what would she have to do that? And does she have sufficient parameters to be able to do that, or is her own reputation so tarnished that it would probably require another government to be able to take on that task?
On the moderating influence of Brazil, did anybody want to comment on that? I think that Brazil in general has been shy in its foreign policy. They want a seat on this Security Council of the United Nations, but they don't act like a world power that throws its weight around, including in the region. Oh yes, when Bolivia or Paraguay do something that annoys them, they certainly make their views known and their weight felt a little bit. But in general, I would say no. They just like they have not exercised any moderating influence on, say, Venezuela, or impose some conditions on Venezuela's entry into Mercosur, say. They have not exercised a moderating influence in Argentina. But I think it's not Argentina-specific issue. It's in general, Brazil wants to be a world player, but I don't think they're willing to pay the price.
Let me expand on that a little bit. At Mar del Plata in 2005, I think we saw the position Brazil likes to play vis-a-vis Argentina. Brazil was quite happy to be Latin America's good cop to Argentina's bad cop. Even though Brazil and Argentina shared the position that the FTAA negotiations should not go ahead without the U.S. addressing the agricultural subsidies issue, the Argentines proclaimed it very loudly, as President Kirchner did during the plenary of the summit, in a very emotional and way in which some people were insulted, etc. The Brazilians allowed the Argentines to take the lead, and the next day welcomed President Bush in Brasilia with a big hug, a tremendous photo op, and of course the story throughout the world was Brazil is our strategic partner, Argentina was a bad host. When in fact they had the same position, but the Brazilians had very much better PR than the Argentines. I agree with you about the moderating influence, there is none, but certainly Brazil is much better at PR.
I would also concur. If Brazil has exerted any moderating influence, it has done in a manner that has been so subtle that it's a true credit to the sophistication of Brazilian diplomacy. I think Brazil has been notably displeased with the economic issues. There have been somewhat of a mini trade war between Brazil and Argentina over the Argentine currency controls, which have badly impacted Argentina's purchase of import of products from Brazil, and there's been some tit for tat quid pro quo. And yet at the same time, I think at the political level, Brazil's in a bit of a dilemma, especially with Dilma assuming the presidency from Lula and the support of the Partido dos Trabalhadores, because essentially Brazil has long touted a very left of center internationalist line, as well as of course the the Union of Mercosur, and so when a left-leaning president begins doing things that would essentially rally that leftist ideology, Brazil's in an awkward position to be able to essentially take a right-of-center position to be an enforcer of international regimes. And so I think, as has been pointed out by my colleagues, Brazil's most comfortable position has been to at least publicly do nothing, although being displeased at the trade level.
And the second question on how to change for the better, I think obviously that was my message at the end. It's never too late to make a course correction or to learn how to sail. It's never too late. They certainly can do. Many other governments, we're seeing it in Europe, many other governments have made even 180-degree changes in certain things when they had to and when they admitted to themselves and to the citizenry that there is a problem. I think if the Cristina Kirchner administration were to admit to itself, first of all, that the populist model has run out of money, and that rather than putting more controls and squeezing things more and so on, that's not going to produce growth and employment and improve the popularity of the government among the population. If they were to admit that in front of the mirror, in the Casa Rosada, that in the mirror on the wall, that it's just not working, that this is not a formula for success and continued occupancy in high office, there's certainly many things that could be done. Some would be politically unpopular, definitely, because when you remove price controls or you remove subsidies or you let the exchange rate find its value or whatever, obviously you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. But there are other things that could be done, I think, with minimal cost and political or otherwise. And one of them is to pay all their creditors what they're due, because they're paying 93% of the bondholders to pay the 7% remaining is not going to bust the budget, and to settle with the Paris Club and to come to an understanding with the companies that have been expropriated and so on and so forth. You can pay on the installment plan. There are some of those things. Other governments have done it too. So definitely there's things that can be done very soon and are affordable. And there are other things, yes, where some big choices will have to be made and where explanations will have to be given to the people and failures will have to be admitted. And we see how hard that is even in our own country, right, to admit that certain entitlements need reform.
I would like to make a comment on that because you addressed your question to Arturo. But we are two Arturos today. This is not, I suppose, not very frequent in Washington, but we are two Arturos at the panel. So I will make a comment, second Arturo. But generally speaking, I agree with my tocayo. But I would like to say that the trust, confidence is more easily lost than gained, So once you have destroyed confidence, you have to really do a lot of things to gain it. But as Arturo said, I think that can be done. I think that Argentina is at the crossroads. The government has to decide what track they want to take. If they want to begin to solve things to pay the bills, or if they want to keep on following a different path, understanding that they don't want to be anymore a member of the international community as they have been so far. I think this would be a tremendous mistake. But we've been hearing things coming from the surroundings of the Argentine government, like they are going to denounce the exit convention, or they are considering to denounce all the BITs they have in place, all their bilateral investment treaties they have in place. Are they really considering seriously that? I mean, if they take these kind of steps, they are going to make things much more difficult. But if they want to start doing things in a different way, I think that they are going to be immediately supported by the international community and by many members of the Argentine society, that fortunately civil society in Argentina is still very healthy, very plural, and I'm sure that a lot of good things can come from Argentina. So I hope that these crossroads are going to be well dealt with by the Argentine government at this moment, and then things will become to get better.
We want to be in good graces with the press.
We have even-handed.
Yeah, I am Ana Barón from Argentina, from Clarín. As you all know, there is this big meeting on the IMF coming up at the beginning of February where they are going to discuss the statistics. So I wanted to know, what do you think the IMF should do? What is at stake apparently is a motion of censure because Argentina has not really progressed on ameliorating the quality of the statistics. But there are some people that say that if the IMF sanctions in any way Argentina, the only one that will benefit is Cristina, because she can say, well, once again the IMF is intervening in our economy, and from the political point of view, Cristina could benefit. So I would like to ask the panel.
I think it's an excellent question, and frankly, I think the IMF and especially the board is in a increasingly difficult position. They have a choice to make that they keep trying to escape from, that they don't want to make, but they're going to have to make. And either way, the IMF is going to lose something. So on the one hand, obviously, if the IMF continues to punt this down the road, it's very difficult for essentially sovereign nations to decide that a G20 nation is, should be kicked out or should be sanctioned, and so it would be very controversial. The IMF basically would expose itself to being, farther demonized throughout Latin America by those who would rally against these tools of Western hegemony, etc. And so in many ways, the IMF is defending its institutional position to not do anything and hope that the problem just goes away. We understand that Christine Lagarde is deeply frustrated and keeps trying to send messages, fig leaves, so that the Cristina government will do things. But the Cristina government apparently keeps ignoring that. I mentioned before that there are the economic interests at stake. On the board, you have Russia and China, both of which you have economic interests, especially in the formerly Repsol field. And so there's another reason why the board probably will not vote against. In all likelihood, they will probably find a way to boot it from the board to the larger body, who I understand meets twice annually, who technically has more authority to be able to sanction a sovereign state. So what should they do? If you vote on principle, as my colleagues have pointed out, at some point you have to decide, are you going to acknowledge that the rules of international law mean something and you enforce them, or are you going to say they do not, for political reasons? And I think it's trying to avoid having to make that choice, because either way they lose.
And again, just to add a little more detail, Argentina is in violation of two, not one, of the Articles of Agreement of the IMF, which is the founding charter. One relates to the provision of accurate statistics so that the IMF can do its job, including in evaluating, for instance, the spillover effects of what goes on in Argentina on its neighbors. And the other is Article 4 of the Articles of Agreement, which specify that countries must open up their books to the IMF and receive an annual or every 18 months or so visit by a fund mission. Call it an inspection, but you don't have to. And Argentina is the only G20 member that has refused to let the IMF conduct what by its own charter it must conduct on a continuous basis, namely this kind of monitoring, discussion, inspection in Argentina since, I believe, 2006. And so on either one of these failures to comply, Argentina could, and I hope will, be called out. I don't know if red card is the right way to go, but I think so, because what Argentina is doing basically is thumbing its nose at the international rules of the game, as you said, whether in investments or in trade or in nothing else. And if the WTOs of this world, if the IMF of this world, if the Paris Club of this world, if the G20 of this world don't stand up to this kind of misbehavior, and speak out forcefully and make it known that this conduct is unbecoming, then of course you're just opening the door to other countries to follow. And we have some cases, Ecuador, now Belize, and so on, where countries are trying a very Argentine-style approach to paying their debts or not paying their debts, and it should worry us all.
One comment, Argentina is voluntarily a member of IMF, voluntarily a member of WTO, voluntarily a member of ICSID Convention, has voluntarily adhered to different declarations from OECD. So what's the matter? I mean, if you are voluntarily a member of a club, you just have to comply with the rules of the club. And if not, it's clear that you don't want to be a member of it. I really don't understand very well all about this.
Unfortunately, 2 o'clock has tolled, and we have to be fair to the next event that's going to take place here. We have had an extraordinary panel. Extraordinary. It was very good. Let's give them a final round of applause. And I personally thank you for joining us this afternoon for this discussion. Thank you.
I'll look forward to your feedback.